A German Shepherd puppy stood in the snow, turning her back as if asking for help. A note on her harness said, "Keep her warm and reach the church before morning bells." But the road was buried, the storm was closing in, and time was running out. By sunrise, the bells revealed that the puppy had been sent there, but never safely delivered. The former Navy SEAL thought the hardest part would be earning her trust. Instead, she would lead him toward a truth he had avoided for years. No one should carry every promise alone. Where are you watching from today? Stay with us until the end, and tell us what this story means to you. Please like, share, and subscribe as we work toward welcoming our first 1,000 subscribers. By 4:30, the mountains north of Silver Creek had begun disappearing behind the snow. Evan Calloway drove down from the communications station with both hands steady on the wheel and the heater aimed at the windshield. The service road dropped through dark stands of pine before joining the county highway below. Fresh snow covered the tire tracks he had made that morning, and the western sky held a cold blue light that seemed brighter than the land beneath it. The generator at the station was running again. A frozen breather line had been the problem. Small, ordinary, easy to miss. Evan had replaced it, logged the pressure readings in the mustard yellow notebook he carried in his thigh pocket, and tested the automatic transfer twice. He trusted machines most after they had been tested twice. His right knee ached from kneeling on frozen concrete. Each time he moved his foot from the accelerator to the brake, a dull pressure climbed beneath the old surgical scars. At 50, Evan remained broad-shouldered and strong, but strength had become something he managed rather than something he assumed. He rounded a bend, bordered by old ponderosa pines. Something stepped into his headlights. Evan braked hard enough to make the tool case slide behind the passenger seat. A small animal stood in the middle of the road. For 1 second, it faced the truck. Then it turned its back. Evan stared through the moving snow. The animal looked over one shoulder, ears too large for its narrow head. One ear lifted halfway, the other folded near the tip. A German Shepherd puppy. "Lord above," Evan said quietly. He switched on the hazard lights and checked the mirrors. No headlights showed behind him. The road was empty except for the puppy and the snow sweeping across the beams. The puppy did not run toward the warmth of the truck. It also did not retreat to the trees. It stood with its back toward him, trembling lightly, then glanced over its shoulder again. Evan eased the truck onto the shoulder and stopped several yards away. He knew enough not to rush a frightened animal. Years ago, impatience had sometimes been called decisiveness. Age had taught him the difference. Evan pulled on his insulated gloves, opened the door without slamming it, and stepped into the wind. Snow gathered at once on his dark brown boots and across the shoulders of his blue-gray utility jacket. Beneath it, the collar of his green camouflage work shirt showed against his neck. The military pattern had outlasted the uniform. It was simply durable cloth now, good for crawling behind machinery and carrying tools. The puppy backed away 3 steps. Evan stopped. "All right," he said. That was too much. He lowered himself carefully, keeping most of his weight on his left leg. His right knee protested before he reached a crouch. He turned one shoulder away from the puppy and held a gloved hand low. The puppy watched him. Dark, honey-colored fur showed beneath the black saddle along its back. Snow clung to the tips of its whiskers and the edges of its blue-gray harness. Evan made no kissing sound and called no name. He had neither permission nor name enough for either. The puppy turned its back once more. This time, Evan saw the paper. A folded white sheet had been tied to the upper strap of the harness with a strip of pale cloth. The paper shifted in the wind, tapping softly against the puppy's back. Evan remained still. The puppy looked over its shoulder as if waiting for fingers to find the buckle. The gesture stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to recognition. Not because he understood what the puppy wanted, but because he knew what it was to stand near help and still have no language for asking. He moved forward one slow step. The puppy's weight shifted toward the trees. Evan stopped again and removed his right glove. He placed the bare hand low above the snow. Cold reached into his knuckles. The puppy sniffed the air. After several seconds, it approached far enough to touch his fingers with its nose. The contact lasted less than a breath. Then it withdrew and turned around again. Evan reached toward the paper. The puppy flinched, but did not run. Easy. He held the harness strap instead of the puppy's body and worked the wet cloth loose. The paper came free. Evan kept it where the puppy could see it before unfolding it beneath the truck's headlights. The handwriting was uneven, the letters slanting downhill across the page. Her name is Belle. Please keep her warm. Below it, written more heavily, take her to St. Luke before the morning bells. There was no surname, no phone number, no explanation. Belle pressed her nose against the lower edge of the paper. Evan looked toward the white road stretching downhill. St. Luke stood on the far side of Silver Creek, less than 15 miles away by the shortest route. He returned to the truck with Belle following at a cautious distance. He placed the note on the passenger side floor, opened the navigation screen, and checked the road alerts. The eastern approach to town remained open. The road to St. Luke did not. A county plow had cleared the main highway, but pushed a dense wall of snow across the smaller church road. The alternate route climbed a steep ridge, already marked closed because of drifting. Evan studied the map, while Belle stood just beyond the reach of the headlights. He could try the ridge. In another vehicle, with chains and better visibility, he might have considered it. But the light was fading, the wind was strengthening, and a 9-week-old puppy was already shaking beside the road. Taking unnecessary risk was not courage. He had learned that lesson later than he should have. Evan called the nearest veterinary clinic. A woman answered after the third ring. "This is Dr. Naomi Sutter." Her voice was calm and alert, without the false brightness people sometimes used when they were tired. Evan gave his name, location, the puppy's estimated age and condition. He described the harness, the note, and the blocked road. Breathing? Even. Can she stand? She's standing now. Any vomiting, blood, obvious swelling? No. Bring her here, Naomi said. Call animal control before you leave the site. Photograph where you found her, including the road marker. And do not put direct heat against her skin. Evan glanced at Belle. She may not get into the truck. Then make the truck less frightening than the road. The line went quiet. It was practical advice. Evan respected it. He photographed the shoulder, the pines, and the nearest mileage sign. Then he called the county dispatcher and reported the found dog. The dispatcher created an incident number and told him the shelter was operating on storm limits. When Evan returned to the passenger door, Belle had moved closer to the truck. He opened it and laid his folded fleece jacket across the seat. The note went on top. Belle raised her nose. Evan waited. The puppy stretched forward, placed one front paw on the running board, and pulled it back. She tried again. Her lighter-colored toes slipped on the wet metal. Evan lowered his hand beside the harness. Belle turned her back. This time, he understood the invitation well enough. He slid one arm under her chest and the other beneath her hindquarters. Belle stiffened, but did not struggle. She weighed less than the tool case that had shifted behind his seat. Inside the cab, Evan wrapped her in the fleece and placed the note where she could see it. He raised the heat gradually. Belle kept one paw over the folded paper. Halfway to town, she began trembling less. At the clinic, Naomi Sutter met them in a treatment room, warmed by a portable heater. She was 58, slender, and straight-backed, with dark hair touched by silver and tucked behind her ears. Her teal scrubs were covered by a gray medical jacket. Nothing about her movements was hurried. She offered Belle the back of her hand. Belle smelled it, then looked for the note. Naomi noticed. "Keep that close." The examination remained quiet and methodical. Temperature low, but not dangerously so. Mild dehydration. No fractures, cuts, or swelling. Heart and lungs clear. Blood glucose slightly below normal, most likely from cold and missed food. The microchip scanner remained silent. Naomi photographed Belle, recorded the location, and sent the found animal report to county control. With the shelter limiting intake during the storm, Evan was offered an emergency foster form. He read every line. The form required him to return Belle if lawful ownership was established. It authorized follow-up checks and prohibited transfer to anyone else without approval. Naomi watched him reach the signature line. "You can say no." Evan looked at Belle. A technician had moved the note to the counter while preparing softened puppy food. Belle stood beside the bowl but did not eat. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper. Evan moved the protected note back beside the dish. Belle sniffed it, then took one cautious bite. Something tightened behind Evan's ribs. Years before, he had left his father with a list of phone numbers and the assurance that a neighbor would check in. He had called it a plan because calling it a plan made leaving easier. The neighbor had gone out of town. His father had not called anyone. By the time help came, there had been nothing left to change. Evan signed the foster form. "I'll take her." Naomi did not praise him. She simply handed him feeding instructions, a borrowed bed, a leash, and an appointment card. "That is not the same as owning her," she said. "I understand. And caring for her does not give you the right to decide who deserves her." Evan met her eyes. "I understand that too." He hoped it was true. The storm softened after dark. Evan carried Belle into his timber house and placed the borrowed bed near the heater, far enough away to avoid direct heat. He set water beside it and folded a clinic towel across the cushion. Belle inspected the bed. Then she took the towel in her mouth, dragged it across the floor, and settled on the rubber tray where Evan normally left his boots. Evan stood with one boot half removed. Belle placed her chin across the toe of the other. For the first time that day, Evan almost smiled. That cost the clinic more than the tray. Belle closed her eyes. Evan moved both boots to the dining table. The house had been quiet since his father died. Quiet in the orderly way of rooms where nothing expected an answer. That night, small sounds moved through it. Claws against wood. Water lapped from a bowl. The soft rustle of a puppy turning in sleep. Evan sat on the floor nearby with the yellow notebook open on his knee. 6:40 p.m. Water. 6:55. Small meal. 7:20. Sleeping. Breathing steady. He checked the front door lock twice. Sometime before dawn, a sound crossed the valley. One slow bell. Then another. Then a third. Belle's head rose. Both ears shifted toward the dark window. She stood, crossed the floor, and took the borrowed leash between her teeth. With one ear half folded and the note still resting beside the tray, Belle carried the leash to Evan's chair. She placed it against his boot. Then she turned her back and looked over her shoulder. The county plow reached Evans Road shortly after 8. By then, the storm had passed east, leaving Silver Creek beneath a clear winter sky so bright that every roofline seemed cut from glass. Snow lay deep along the shoulders, but the main highway had been opened to a single narrow lane. Belle stood at the front door before Evan finished his coffee. She wore the blue-gray harness Naomi had checked the night before. The repaired yellow stitching along one strap showed when Belle turned her back and looked over her shoulder, waiting for Evan to fasten the leash. He pulled the buckle twice. Click. Click. Belle's ears shifted toward the sound. "You're beginning to expect competence," Evan said. "That could become a problem." Her right ear folded at the tip as if reserving judgment. The road toward town wound between snow-covered ranch fences and low hills bright under the morning sun. Belle rode in the borrowed crate behind the passenger seat. The protected note had been clipped inside the door where she could see it. Evan had slept less than 2 hours. He told himself it was because Belle had needed to go outside twice. The truth was less convenient. He had spent much of the night looking at the words before the morning bells and wondering what kind of person wrote instructions for a puppy but left no number to call. St. Luke stood near the western edge of Silver Creek, a modest stone church with a narrow steeple and a roof steep enough to shed heavy snow. The building was not grand. It looked built for weather rather than admiration. As Evan turned into the cleared parking lot, the bell sounded once from the tower. Belle rose inside the crate. A second strike followed. She pressed both front paws against the door. By the third, she was making a low, urgent sound in her throat. Evan parked and opened the crate. Belle stepped into the snow, shook once, then pulled toward the church. She did not lower her nose and follow some invisible trail. Her attention stayed on the building itself, the tower, the side entrance, and the covered walkway leading behind the sanctuary. She had been here before. Belle slipped once on a patch of packed snow, recovered, and continued around the building. Evan shortened the leash without lifting her from the ground. She led him past a row of bare lilac bushes and beneath an awning where several wooden benches faced the valley. Belle stopped at the last bench. She pawed at the thin snow beneath it, revealing dark boards and a scattering of pine needles. Then she sat down and looked toward the closed door of the adjoining fellowship hall. Evan touched the bench. No blanket, no bowl, nothing hidden beneath it. Only a place Belle expected someone to be. The door opened behind him. "Unless you've come to repair the boiler," a woman said. "You're the earliest visitor we've had since Christmas." Reverend Miriam Beckett stepped outside carrying a white travel mug with a crack near the handle. She was in her mid-60s, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair cut short and tortoise-shell glasses resting low on her nose. A dark red wool coat reached below her knees. Her attention moved from Evan to Belle. The humor left her face. "Oh," she said. Belle stood. Miriam did not approach immediately. She placed her mug on the windowsill, removed one glove, and lowered her hand. "Belle?" The puppy leaned forward, but stayed close to Evan's boot. Miriam looked at the harness, then at the clear sleeve clipped beside it. "Where did you find her?" Evan told her. Miriam read the note without touching it. Recognition came before she reached the final line. "That is Margaret Hale's handwriting." Who is Margaret Hale? The woman who was supposed to be sitting on this bench yesterday morning. Belle pressed one paw against the wood. Miriam led them into the fellowship hall. The room smelled faintly of coffee, floor wax, and the pine branches arranged around a wooden cross near the far wall. Folding tables had been stacked against one side. A corkboard held meal schedules, volunteer notices, and a faded flyer bearing the words, "Second Hearth Pet Support." Miriam filled a shallow bowl with water. Belle drank, then positioned herself beneath the table where she could see both adults. "Margaret is 75, Miriam said. Retired home care nurse, widowed 12 years. She started Second Hearth after one of our members delayed surgery because no one could take his cat. What happened to her? A mild stroke 6 days ago. She is in rehabilitation outside Leadville. Can she speak for herself? Some days better than others. Her mind is clear, according to the social worker, but her right side is still weak." Evan set the protected note on the table. "Did she ask anyone here to take Belle?" Miriam looked again at the handwriting. "She asked her nephew to bring Belle here. I was expecting them before the first call round. The church was locked. The front doors were. The side office opens at 6:30. She lifted her mug, then seemed to think better of drinking from it. This was not meant to be a note for a stranger. The sentence changed the room. Until then, Evan had imagined an unknown hand tying a final request to a puppy and walking away. Now the paper looked different. Not a farewell. A handoff card that had never reached the person waiting to receive it. Belle placed her chin over Evan's boot. Miriam crossed to an old wooden cabinet and unlocked it. Inside were binders, clipboards, and a metal cash box. Several hooks on the inner door stood empty. Each hook had a paper label beneath it. Wren, Dalton, Ruiz, Hale. "What is all this?" Evan asked. "Second Hearth, or what is left of it?" Miriam explained that the morning bells once marked the start of a volunteer call schedule. Older residents living alone with animals would receive a brief check-in. If someone had a medical appointment, hospital stay, or temporary mobility problem, volunteers arranged food, transportation, or short-term care. "It sounds organized." "It looked organized," Miriam said. There was no self-pity in her voice, only an accountant's dislike of an incorrect total. Margaret kept too much of it in her own head. Colin helped with the bank account and supply runs. I handled the meeting room and assumed the rest was being documented. "You assumed?" "Yes." Miriam met his eyes. "Churches are capable of faith, Mr. Calloway. We are also capable of poor filing." A truck engine growled outside. Belle lifted her head. The side door opened before Miriam reached it. A stocky man in a faded canvas jacket entered, carrying cold air and the smell of diesel. He appeared to be in his early 40s. Brown hair showed beneath a navy cap with a peeling snow removal logo. His beard had been cut unevenly, as though grooming had fallen below several other emergencies. He stopped when he saw Belle. Relief crossed his face first. Then caution replaced it. "You found her?" Evan stood but kept the leash loose. "You're Colin Hale?" The man nodded. "Margaret's nephew." Colin removed his cap and turned it in his hands. "I came for the files and the dog." Belle moved behind Evan's right leg. The gesture was not a verdict. Belle was a young animal in an unfamiliar room, choosing the person who had fed her and kept her warm. Evan understood that. Still, Colin saw it. His mouth tightened. "She knows me." "I didn't say she didn't. I cared for her all week." "Then tell me why she was beside the county road." Colin glanced at Miriam. "I brought her here yesterday. The doors were locked. I had an appointment I couldn't miss." "So you left her?" "I left her where people pass. In a snowstorm." "There was no storm when I stopped." "Snow was already falling." Colin's eyes sharpened. "You were there?" "I found her 20 minutes before dark. And she is alive." Evan felt the old pressure rise inside him, the need to make the room simple by placing one person on the correct side of a line. Colin did it for him. "The plan wasn't perfect," he said. "But it worked." Miriam's voice remained quiet. "No, someone else accepted the risk you left behind. That is not the same thing." Colin looked away. Belle emerged, far enough to smell the leg of his work pants. Colin lowered a hand too quickly. She retreated. He stopped reaching. For the first time, the shame in his face looked larger than the anger. "I had a lender waiting," he said. 3 men who haven't been paid. 2 trucks down. Margaret's bills coming in. I thought somebody would see the note." Evan did not soften. Hard circumstances explained pressure. They did not turn a roadside into a doorway. Colin pulled a folded document from inside his jacket. "I have power of attorney for Margaret. I can place Belle with a rescue." Evan read the heading without taking the paper. "Financial power of attorney. It lets me manage her affairs." Not every decision in her life. Colin reached for the leash. Evan stepped between them. The movement was small, but final. "I am not claiming Belle," Evan said. "I am following the county hold. You can call animal control." Colin did. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. He gave names, dates, and document numbers. The dispatcher placed him on hold twice before confirming that the financial authorization did not automatically establish his right to remove Belle while Margaret's decision-making capacity was under review. Belle would remain in Evan's emergency foster care until the county received direction from Margaret, her authorized personal representative, or a court. Colin lowered the phone. "This is absurd." "No," Miriam said. "It is inconvenient. Those are not always the same thing." He turned toward the cabinet. "Second hearth is closed anyway." Miriam went still. "Who closed it?" "I did. There is no money. Margaret cannot run it. The house may have to be sold." "You sent no replacement plan." "There is no replacement." Miriam opened one of the binders. A red tab marked medical appointments. Several names had been crossed out. Beside one entry, someone had written twice in pencil, "Harold Wren, cardiology canceled. No care for Patch." Miriam traced the line without touching it. "He canceled again." Colin said nothing. Belle settled beneath the corkboard, her eyes moving whenever the bell rope shifted faintly inside the wall. Miriam closed the binder. "Margaret built this because people were choosing between their own health and the animals waiting at home. She cannot keep running it." "Perhaps not." Miriam looked at Evan, then at Colin. "But you do not get to confuse a woman losing strength with a woman losing her right to speak." She reached for the office phone and called the rehabilitation center. Her second call went to Rebecca Sloan with County Senior Services, a woman who handled questions involving financial authority and vulnerable adults. Outside, sunlight moved across the snow-covered valley. Inside, Belle rested beneath a list of people whose calls had stopped being answered. The paper on her harness had brought one puppy to safety. The cabinet suggested she had not been the only one left waiting. The rehabilitation center sat above the highway on a shelf of cleared land, its long windows facing the white shoulders of the mountains. Evan arrived 10 minutes early. He had learned long ago that arriving early gave a man time to study a room before the room began asking things of him. That morning, however, the habit offered little comfort. Belle shifted beside his boots in the lobby, testing the polished floor with one front paw and withdrawing it as though the building had been made of thin ice. "It isn't going to improve by staring at it," Evan told her. Belle looked up at him, her right ear folded at the tip. A nurse laid 2 rubber-backed mats across the floor. Belle crossed them at once. Evan almost smiled. The puppy did not need courage explained to her. She needed better footing. Rebecca Sloan came down the hall carrying a dark red leather case against one hip. At 61, she had the straight posture of someone who had spent years entering rooms where families had already decided what the truth ought to be. Her brown hair, streaked with silver, was tied low at the back of her neck. Thin metal glasses rested in one hand. "Mr. Calloway?" "Evan. Rebecca Sloan, County Senior Services." She did not offer him praise for finding Belle. She did not ask about the Navy. Evan liked her immediately for both omissions. Rebecca crouched only far enough to let Belle smell her fingers, then stood before the puppy had to retreat. "Mrs. Hale requested that the meeting remain small," she said. "You, Reverend Beckett, Mr. Hale, the facility social worker, and me. Can Margaret make the decision about Belle? That is one of the questions we are here to separate from the others." "Separate?" "People often treat capacity as one light switch, on or off." Rebecca put on her glasses. "A person may need help balancing a bank statement and still understand where her dog should live. Our job is not to take every decision away because one decision has become difficult." The words followed Evan down the hall. Margaret Hale waited in a private therapy room overlooking a courtyard filled with untouched snow. She sat in a chair with wooden arms, a graphite cane positioned beside her left leg. She was smaller than Evan had imagined, but there was nothing diminished about the way she watched the door. Her silver-white hair had been cut just below her ears. A pale green sweater softened the sharp winter light around her face. Her right hand rested stiffly on her thigh. The left remained free. Miriam stood near the window in a navy wool jacket. Colin occupied the far end of the room, his faded cap turning slowly between his hands. No one spoke when Belle entered. Belle took 2 steps onto the carpet and stopped. Margaret did not call her name. She did not lean forward or fill the silence with encouragement. She raised her left hand and tapped twice against the wooden arm of the chair. Belle's head lifted. 2 small sounds. Nothing more. The puppy crossed the room. She touched her nose to Margaret's open palm, smelled the sleeve of her sweater, and pressed close enough that Margaret could run her fingers along the side of Belle's neck. Belle then circled once and lowered herself across Margaret's shoes. Margaret closed her eyes. Not for long. 1 breath, perhaps 2. When she opened them, she looked at Evan. "You kept the harness." "It fits." The blue one frightened her less than the red. Her speech was measured. Certain consonants required care, but every word arrived where she intended it to land. Evan nodded toward Belle. "She is eating, sleeping better. Naomi found no serious medical problem. Does she still steal cloth? She relocated my clinic towel and 1 wool sock. That means she is feeling well." A faint warmth passed through the room, then disappeared when Margaret turned to Miriam. "Who has the morning list?" Miriam lowered her gaze. "No one has the whole list." "Who called Harold Wren?" "I did yesterday. And before yesterday." Silence answered. Belle shifted across Margaret's shoes, but did not rise. Colin put his cap on the empty chair beside him. "The program is closed, Aunt Margaret. People were notified." "Notified of what?" "That we could not continue." Margaret's left hand remained on Belle's shoulder. "Were they given replacements?" "There were no replacements." "Then they were not given a plan. They were given an ending." Evan watched Colin's jaw tighten. The man looked less like someone prepared to defend a decision than someone exhausted from defending the same decision to himself. Margaret turned back to the protected note on the table. "I wrote that at 6 in the morning, she said, "the day after I arrived here." She explained that Belle had stayed temporarily with Colin after the stroke. When the rehabilitation center confirmed the puppy could not remain in Margaret's room, she called Miriam and arranged for Belle to be delivered to St. Luke before the morning volunteer calls. "I wrote the instructions because my hand would not make the letters cleanly," Margaret said. "I was afraid he might forget what Belle needed." Colin stared at the floor. "I did not forget." "No," Margaret said. "You chose something else." He raised his head. "The office door was locked. I was already late. The lender had driven from Denver, and if I missed that meeting, 3 men were going home without another week of work." "You could have waited." "I had already waited on everything else." The words came out sharper than he intended. Colin breathed through his nose and tried again. "I thought someone would stop. That road has feed trucks, church traffic, county crews. I left the instructions where they could be seen." Margaret's hand paused on Belle's neck. "You turned the hope that someone else might pass into a plan." Colin flinched, as if she had raised her voice. She had not. Rebecca opened a folder on her lap. "Mrs. Hale, do you understand that Belle is currently under a county emergency foster hold?" "Yes." "Do you understand that Mr. Calloway is not yet Belle's legal owner?" "Yes." "Do you want Belle returned to your physical care today?" Margaret looked down at the young German shepherd stretched across her feet. Belle had already grown since the photograph taken the day Margaret received her. The puppy's legs were longer. Her paws looked too large for the rest of her. Energy waited in every small movement, even while she rested. Margaret tried to reposition her right foot beneath the chair. The effort took both concentration and time. "No," she said. Colin looked up. Evan did not move. Margaret continued before anyone could mistake the answer for surrender. "I cannot turn quickly enough if she pulls. I cannot carry her downstairs. I cannot promise that my hand will open her medicine or close her harness every day." Belle raised her head at the change in Margaret's voice. "I know what love feels like," Margaret said. "That does not mean love has made my balance better." The facility social worker, a quiet woman seated beside Rebecca, made a note. Rebecca asked, "Where do you want Belle to remain while you continue rehabilitation?" "With Mr. Calloway, if he agrees and the county approves." Evan felt every face in the room turn toward him. "I agree." The answer came too quickly. Margaret noticed. "You have work. I can adjust it. You have a house that was not prepared for a puppy. It is now. You have an injured knee. It functions." Belle left Margaret's shoes, crossed the carpet, and settled beside Evan's right boot. Margaret studied the way he shifted his weight away from that leg. "You are very practiced at answering before anyone can offer help." Evan's shoulders stiffened. "We are discussing Belle. We are discussing the same mistake in different clothing." Colin gave a humorless breath that might have been a laugh. Evan looked at him once, and the sound ended. Miriam moved away from the window. "Evan offered to look at Margaret's house," she said. "The heating system, steps, and backup power." "I can make a list today," Evan said. "I can repair the generator, organize the remaining volunteers, and call everyone in those files. Belle can stay with me until the house is ready." He heard the shape of the plan as he spoke it. Each task precise, each problem assigned, all of it assigned to him. Margaret leaned back carefully. "That is not a system. It is a beginning. It is one man making himself necessary to every part. If something needs doing, someone has to do it. Yes." Margaret glanced at the cane beside her chair. "That is what I told myself for 11 years. The room became still. She described Second Hearth without defending it. She had kept the passwords because changing them took time. She had corrected volunteer schedules instead of teaching Celia how she wanted them arranged. She had stored emergency instructions in her own kitchen because everyone knew where to find her, until they could not find her. "I called it devotion," Margaret said. "Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was pride wearing work clothes." Miriam folded her hands. A short prayer had been written on a small card beside the window. "Give us wisdom for the work we can do, and humility for the work we must share." No one read it aloud. They did not need to. Evan looked at Belle between the two chairs. The puppy had chosen neither side of the room. She rested in the open space, close enough to reach both of them. Rebecca removed her glasses. "The medical team expects to complete Mrs. Hale's capacity assessment within 48 hours, she said. "Preliminary findings indicate she understands her personal decisions. Financial matters require a separate review." Colin's fingers closed around the edge of the chair. Rebecca continued. "For the next 11 days, our goals are limited. We confirm Mrs. Hale's authority to revoke or restrict the financial power of attorney. We pause any property transaction until that is settled. We create a safe discharge plan, and we document Belle's temporary placement." "We are not reopening Second Hearth?" Miriam asked. "Not in 11 days. Margaret nodded. "Good." Evan looked at her. "You don't want it reopened?" "I don't want the same weak structure standing up long enough to fall on someone else." Rebecca asked Miriam to produce the church's administrative records. She asked Colin for every bank statement, invoice, and transfer connected to Second Hearth. His face changed only slightly, but Evan saw it. Not guilt proven. Fear revealed. Colin looked toward Margaret. "There are bills you do not know about." "Then we will know about them," she said. Rebecca closed the folder. Before the meeting ended, Margaret signed a temporary care preference, stating that Belle should remain with Evan under county supervision. Her left-handed signature was slow and uneven, but no one guided the pen. Evan clipped Belle's leash to the harness. Belle turned back toward Margaret. The older woman tapped the chair twice. Belle crossed the room, touched her hand once, and returned to Evan without being called. Margaret watched her go. She did not ask Evan to promise that Belle would come back. Instead, she said, "Do not let caring for her become another reason no one is allowed to help you." Evan placed 2 fingers against the harness buckle and tested it twice. The sound seemed louder in the quiet room. When he reached the doorway, Rebecca spoke behind him. "Mr. Hale, I will need the full account history, not the summaries." Evan did not turn around. Colin's answer came after a long pause. "All right." Outside the windows, sunlight lay clean across the courtyard snow. Inside, the first honest decision had been made. The rest would require records. The missing money did not announce itself dramatically. It appeared in ordinary black numbers printed across 6 months of bank statements and spread over a folding table inside St. Luke's Fellowship Hall. Rebecca Sloan sat at one end, with her metal-framed glasses low on her nose. Miriam occupied the other, a legal pad beside her cracked white travel mug. Between them, Celia Boone moved through receipts with the brisk concentration of someone accustomed to finding order while everyone else was still explaining the emergency. Celia was 71, small and square-shouldered, with cropped silver hair and a hearing device behind her left ear. A pencil rested above the other. "Face me when you speak," she told Colin without looking up. "The machine helps. It does not perform miracles." Colin sat opposite her in his faded work jacket, both hands wrapped around his navy cap. A retired accountant from the church's regional office had already matched the invoices against the account. Second Hearth was not an independent charity. It had operated under St. Luke's administrative umbrella, using a separate account that Margaret and Colin could both access. The arrangement had worked for years because the program was small and everyone trusted the people involved. Trust, Rebecca had said, was not an auditing system. Miriam had not argued. Evan stood near the window with Belle at his feet. He had no role in reviewing financial records, and Rebecca had been clear about that. He was present because Margaret had asked him to bring Belle after her morning therapy session. Belle chewed one corner of a cardboard archive box until Celia moved it out of reach. "Your assistant lacks respect for documentation," Celia said. "She is still in training," Evan replied. Belle immediately stole the pencil that had fallen from Celia's clipboard. Celia held out her hand. Belle backed beneath Evan's chair. "Training appears underfunded." For a moment, Miriam smiled. Then the accountant turned another statement around. 3 transfers had been labeled transportation reimbursement. 2 more appeared as emergency property repair. A 6th had been divided between supplies and temporary labor. The invoices attached to them belonged to Colin's snow removal company. Rebecca placed a finger beside the total. $18,400. No one spoke. The number was too large to be explained as a mistake, and too carefully divided to be called confusion. Margaret sat in a wheelchair beside the table, her graphite cane resting across the arm. She had insisted on attending in person after both physicians signed the assessment, confirming that she understood her financial and personal decisions. Her left hand rested on Belle's protected handoff card. "Tell it in order," Margaret said. Colin turned the cap in his hands. "The north truck lost its transmission." Celia looked up. "That is not the beginning," he swallowed. "The county payment was late. Earlier. Colin's shoulders lowered. He began again. The company had won a winter maintenance contract covering 3 rural roads. To keep it, he needed 2 working plows and enough money to pay 3 employees. Then one truck lost its transmission. A second suffered a hydraulic failure 4 days later. The bank refused to extend his credit. The county payment remained delayed. Colin took $3,200 from Second Hearth to cover payroll. "I thought it would be 10 days, he said. "Maybe 12. Margaret's expression did not change. When the payment did not come, I repaired the second truck. With more of the fund. Yes. And after that, he used another transfer to conceal the first shortage, then another to cover insurance and fuel. By the time Margaret suffered the stroke, the money he had promised himself he would replace had become a hole too deep to hide without selling something. The house had seemed like the answer. Not because Margaret had asked to sell it, because Colin had convinced himself she would never be able to return. "I had an appraisal done," he said. "Nothing was signed." "You prepared to list it," Rebecca said. "I prepared options." Celia's pencil stopped. "That is the language people use when the truthful noun makes them uncomfortable." Colin looked toward Margaret. "The house needs work. Your rehabilitation costs money. The company employs people who have families." "All true," Margaret said. A flicker of hope crossed his face. Then she continued, "And none of it made the money yours." The words were neither loud nor cruel. They left no place for argument. Miriam closed her eyes briefly. "I approved the summaries," she said. "I did not request the original statements." Margaret looked at her. "I told you the account was small." "You did." "I made carelessness sound humble." Miriam nodded once. "And I accepted that because it was easier." Evan watched the admission move across the table. No one passed the blame far enough away to keep their own hands clean. That, he thought, might be what confession was supposed to look like. Not a performance of shame, but an accurate naming of what had happened. Rebecca laid out the next steps. Margaret would sign a formal revocation of Colin's financial authority with an independent elder law attorney. The attorney would notify the bank and any real estate agent contacted about the house. The property could not be listed or transferred without Margaret's direct approval. The account records would be referred for legal review. Colin would turn over every invoice, password, and device connected to Second Hearth. "No summaries," Rebecca said. Colin nodded. Belle crawled from beneath Evan's chair and lay near Margaret's wheelchair, the stolen pencil between her paws. Margaret bent as far as her balance allowed. "Belle!" The puppy looked up. Margaret tapped twice against the wooden table leg. Belle released the pencil. Celia retrieved it and examined the teeth marks. At least one member of this program responds to procedure. The meeting ended without forgiveness, and without anyone being marched away in handcuffs. Colin left carrying a list of records he was required to produce by the following afternoon. Evan watched him cross the parking lot alone. He knew exactly what he was doing, Evan said. Rebecca closed her leather case. He knew each step. That is the same thing. Not always. Evan looked at her. Rebecca continued. People rarely wake up and choose the worst thing all at once. They choose the first smaller thing, then protect it with another. That does not reduce the damage. No. It tells us what must be repaired. 2 days later, they met at Margaret's house. The property sat beyond the eastern edge of town, on 3 acres of sloping land. Snow covered the dormant garden and collected along the cedar fence. The house was a 2-story structure built in the late 1950s, with narrow steps, a deep rear porch, and a roof that had begun shedding shingles near the chimney. Evan arrived with Naomi Sutter and a licensed electrician named Wade Ellison, a gray-bearded man who had worked mountain properties long enough to distrust any wire hidden behind decorative paneling. Evan opened his mustard-yellow notebook before reaching the porch. "Front rail," he said. "New latch. Exterior lighting. Generator service." Margaret stood beside Rebecca, one hand on her cane. "You have not entered the house. The front rail is loose. That does not make the rest of the list prophetic." Evan put the pencil behind his ear. They moved inside. The first difficulty appeared before Margaret reached the living room. The threshold required her to lift her right foot higher than she could manage comfortably. Evan offered an arm. She accepted it after one failed attempt, not before. The hallway beyond was narrow. A rug shifted under her cane. The bedroom stood at the far end, while the only full bathroom was upstairs. Naomi checked the kitchen and found medication stored above shoulder height. Wade examined the electrical panel and said the wiring could be made safe, but would require more than a weekend. Evan continued writing. Handrails, remove rugs, convert dining room to bedroom, install accessible shower, replace heating controls, regrade rear path. Every problem became a task. Every task became something he could imagine completing. Belle entered the kitchen ahead of them. Her paws slid across the polished wood. The puppy scrambled sideways, bumped a chair, and sent it scraping toward Margaret's cane. Margaret caught the counter with her left hand, while Evan steadied her shoulder. Nothing fell. No one was injured. But the room changed. Belle recovered and stood perfectly still, embarrassed by a mistake she could not understand. Margaret breathed slowly until the tremor in her right hand eased. Evan moved the chair aside. "We can put runners down." "Yes." "Add grips under them." "Yes." "Shift the table. Widen the root." Margaret looked toward the staircase. "And when Belle weighs 70 pounds, we train her. When the furnace fails at midnight, I repair it. When the snow is too deep for me to reach the gate, I clear it. When you are working?" Evan did not answer immediately. Margaret glanced at the notebook in his hand. There it is again. What? One man standing where a system ought to be. The sentence struck harder in her kitchen than it had in the rehabilitation center. Evan closed the notebook. "You want to come home? I want the right to decide what home requires of me." Margaret walked slowly to the window, overlooking the buried garden. She had planted the apple trees with her husband. She had cared for him in the downstairs room during his final winter. Second Hearth had begun at that kitchen table with 4 names and a pot of coffee. The house contained a life. It also contained stairs she could not safely climb and work she no longer wished to pretend she could manage. "I am not selling it, because Colin decided I was finished," she said. Rebecca waited. Margaret placed both hands over the top of her cane. "But I am not moving back, because everyone thinks keeping the house proves I am still myself." Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and turned the snow along the fence almost gold. Margaret had already toured a 1-story apartment near St. Luke. It had wide doors, a small patio, and enough room for Belle to visit without forcing Margaret to manage a young shepherd alone. She wanted to move there. The house would remain hers, while an attorney examined the safest structure for its future. Her proposal was to make it a limited base for a rebuilt support network, not a crowded shelter, but a place to store supplies, train caregivers, and receive 2 or 3 pets during short emergencies. Most animals would stay with verified foster homes. Naomi approved of the limit. Wade said the building could be adapted in stages. Miriam, who had joined them after the financial meeting, asked who would control the new program. Margaret looked around the kitchen. No one. Celia, standing beside the doorway with her aluminum clipboard, raised an eyebrow. Margaret corrected herself. No one alone. The new network would need separate responsibility for finances, veterinary records, scheduling, and property access. No single person would hold every password, key, or decision. Second Hearth Relay, Margaret said, Care should move from one pair of hands to the next without being dropped. Belle leaned against her shin. Margaret lowered her left hand to the puppy's neck. Colin arrived later to deliver the remaining account files. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the group gathered around the kitchen table. Rebecca explained the preliminary conditions being discussed with council and county services. He would surrender all financial access. He would disclose every transfer. He would sign a repayment plan if the legal review allowed a restorative agreement. He would accept supervision and complete assigned community work. He would not independently care for animals through the new network during its initial period. Colin looked at Margaret. "Are you asking them not to charge me?" "No." His face tightened. "I was trying to save the company. And you will help repair what that choice cost. How long before you trust me again?" Margaret's thumb moved once along Belle's harness strap. "You may repair what you broke," she said. "You don't get to decide how long it takes other people to trust the repair." Colin lowered his eyes. No one offered him relief. No one denied him the possibility of doing better. On the kitchen table, Evan opened his yellow notebook to a clean page. For once, he did not begin by writing his own name at the top. Celia drew 4 columns: finance, care, property, scheduling. Outside, the old house stood under the bright Colorado snow, unchanged in timber and stone. Its purpose had already begun to change. 6 weeks changed the old Hale house without making it look new. The front steps gained a second handrail. Loose rugs disappeared. A licensed electrician replaced the unsafe panel in the utility room, while Evan serviced the backup generator and labeled every shutoff valve in plain black lettering. Inside the former dining room, folding tables held binders, medication forms, and plastic containers marked with the names of animals that had not yet arrived. Second Hearth Relay was still only a pilot program. That distinction mattered to Dr. Naomi Sutter. "A pilot is allowed to reveal mistakes," she told the volunteers gathered at the Silver Creek Library. "A promise is what you make after you know which mistakes can hurt someone." Naomi stood beside a projected sample record, her dark hair tucked behind one ear. The form did not ask whether a volunteer loved animals. It asked harder questions. What time did the animal eat? Which medications could be given with food? What behavior indicated pain? Who could authorize emergency treatment? Which veterinarian held the current records? Who was the first backup caregiver? Who was the second? Several people who had signed up during the first week quietly withdrew when they saw the paperwork. Celia Boone did not try to stop them. "Better an honest no on Tuesday," she said, "than a missing person on Friday night." Celia ran the volunteer interviews from a corner table with her aluminum clipboard, digital watch, and a sharpened pencil tucked behind her right ear. She rejected one applicant who had no winter transportation, and another who insisted that experience owning dogs made medication training unnecessary. "You may be wonderful," Celia told the second applicant, "but wonderful is not a dosage." At the far side of the room, Belle stole a roll of blue painter's tape from Evan's open tool bag. The puppy had grown longer in the legs and less certain of what to do with them. Her left ear stood straight. The right still leaned outward when she was tired. Belle carried the tape beneath a chair and began peeling it with her front teeth. Evan noticed only after Naomi stopped speaking and looked past him. "Your assistant is altering the supply inventory." Evan crouched to retrieve it. Belle backed away, tail moving. "Release." Belle held tighter. "Belle!" Celia glanced over her clipboard. "Does she respond to rank?" "No." "Good. That makes 2 of us." A few of the older volunteers laughed. The sound loosened the room in a way no prepared speech could have done. Belle finally traded the tape for a piece of kibble. The lesson resumed. Love for an animal was useful. So were clean records, dependable transportation, and the humility to admit when another person knew more. Evan understood all of that in theory. In practice, he arrived before everyone else. He checked each foster home himself, even after Rebecca had approved the inspection checklist. He drove across the county to test exterior lights that another volunteer had already photographed. He returned to the Hale house after dark to confirm the generator fuel level, then came back at dawn because the temperature had fallen 12 degrees overnight. His mustard-yellow notebook filled with names, measurements, and corrections. Beside many of the tasks, he wrote the same 2 initials. E.C. Margaret noticed during a Thursday planning call from her new apartment near St. Luke. Her speech had grown smoother, though fatigue still slowed her near the end of long conversations. She now walked short distances with her graphite cane and spent 2 afternoons each week training volunteers to speak with older pet owners without treating them like confused patients. "What does EC mean in the property column?" she asked. Evan glanced down at the notebook. "My initials." "I know your initials." "Then why ask?" "Because they appear 14 times. They were 14 things that needed doing." Celia, seated across the table, folded her arms. Margaret continued over the speakerphone. "How many have another name beside them?" Evan did not answer. Belle lay under the table with her back against his boot. The puppy's warmth pressed through the leather as if she had appointed herself witness. "There are qualified people," Margaret said. "There are people who volunteered." "That is not the same as unqualified." "I did not say it was." "You wrote it 14 times." Evan closed the notebook. The next morning, his right knee was swollen beneath his work pants. He ignored it until Wade Ellison arrived to inspect the exterior cable running from the generator shed to the main building. Snow had melted from the south side of the roof and frozen again along the gutter, leaving the ladder feet on hard, uneven ground. Evan positioned the ladder and tested it twice. Celia appeared behind him carrying her clipboard. "Who assigned you the roof?" "No one." That was not the question. "The cable needs inspection. Wade is licensed to inspect it. He's finishing the interior junction. He will finish that and then inspect this." Evan placed one boot on the first rung. Celia gripped the side rail. She was a foot shorter than him and nearly 20 years older. She did not attempt to pull him down. She simply made the ladder unusable. "Move your hand," Evan said. "No. The footing is stable. Your knee is not. I have climbed worse. I'm sure you have." Snow slid from the porch roof and fell in a soft sheet behind them. Celia looked up at him. "You do not lack courage, Evan. You lack a person who is allowed to relieve you." The words irritated him because they were accurate. His father had once complained that Evan arranged help, as though every helper were temporary, and every failure already expected. Evan had dismissed it as stubbornness from an old man who hated being watched. Later, after his father died, Evan had decided the opposite lesson was true. He should have watched more closely. He should have depended on fewer people. He should have been there. The belief had hardened so gradually that he had stopped recognizing it as grief. Evan removed his foot from the ladder. He called Wade outside. Explaining the task took less than a minute. Wade checked the anchors, climbed the ladder, and found a worn section of conduit near the eave. He photographed it, replaced the damaged fitting, and completed the work without Evan standing beneath him. Nothing failed because Evan had stepped away. That fact brought no immediate relief. It only left him with nowhere to hide the truth. Margaret struggled with the same lesson from the opposite side of town. Although Celia had been appointed scheduling coordinator, Margaret continued calling volunteers privately. She changed one feeding assignment after learning a caregiver lived near the animal's veterinarian. She approved a new foster before Rebecca's background check was complete. She mailed handwritten corrections to forms Naomi had already finalized. Celia arrived at Margaret's apartment, carrying 3 conflicting schedules. Margaret invited her in and offered tea. Celia declined both the chair and the tea. "We have 3 versions of Saturday." "I improved the route." You change the route. The new route saves 11 miles and removes the second caregiver from a medication visit. Margaret looked at the papers. I could correct that. That is what you always say. The room grew quiet. On a low shelf near the window sat the silver branch pin Margaret had worn during the early years of Second Hearth. Photographs showed her standing beside cages, pet carriers, and people who trusted her because she always answered. Celia placed the schedules on the table. If every decision still comes through you, this is not relay. It is the old program wearing a new coat. Margaret's left hand tightened around the cane handle. I built it. Yes. I know these people. Yes. And you believe that means I should have no authority. Celia shook her head. I believe authority should survive the day you are tired. Margaret looked away. Through the window, sunlight moved across the apartment courtyard, bright on the packed snow. A woman from the neighboring unit walked slowly beside an elderly Labrador, while another resident carried groceries to her door. Ordinary assistance, given and received without ceremony. Margaret signed the revised role agreement that afternoon. She would train caregivers, advise on complicated placements, and speak with pet owners entering the program. She would not control the daily schedule, approve foster homes alone, or alter assignments without Celia's confirmation. Her signature remained uneven. The choice behind it was not. At the Hale house, Colin continued repairing the rear fence under the conditions set by Rebecca and County Council. He arrived on time, signed in, and worked outside the animal care areas. He did not handle money. He did not hold the main key. He was not permitted to transport or supervise an animal alone. Belle avoided him during the first 2 weeks. Colin stopped trying to win her back. When he filled a water bowl, he placed it down and stepped away. When Belle entered the room, he kept his hands visible and continued working. He did not use her name unless necessary. One afternoon, Evan returned from the generator shed and found Colin seated on the floor beside an unfinished gate panel. Belle stood near the doorway, watching him. Colin tapped twice against the wooden frame. Belle's ears lifted. He placed a piece of kibble on the floor, then moved his hand back. Belle took one step forward. Then she stopped and looked toward Evan. Colin did not call again. Only after Evan entered the room did Belle cross the remaining distance, eat the kibble, and retreat to Evan's side. Colin lowered his eyes to the hinge in his hand. She remembers. Evan studied him. So do you. The words were not forgiveness. Colin seemed to understand that. A person could have cared for an animal and still failed that animal. The care did not erase the failure. The failure did not prove every earlier kindness had been false. Some truths had to remain side by side until actions decided what came next. Harold Wren joined the pilot program near the end of the 6th week. He arrived at the library, wearing a faded olive bomber jacket and carrying a dented metal box. At 79, Harold walked with a slight bend through his upper back, but his white mustache remained trimmed with mechanical precision. Patch, his 11-year-old terrier mix, rode in a carrier secured to a wheeled cart. The dog had one brown patch around the left eye, one upright ear, and one ear folded sideways. Patch regarded Belle with the exhausted suspicion of an older citizen watching youth become unnecessarily energetic. Belle approached the cart. Patch drew his small blue towel closer with one paw. Harold pointed at Belle. That one steps on his blanket. Negotiations are over. She's learning boundaries, Evan said. Then Patch can provide advanced instruction. Harold opened the metal box. Inside were Patch's medication bottles, feeding instructions, veterinary records, and 2 labeled keys. Every page had been written in neat capital letters. Celia reviewed the forms. You chose 2 backup caregivers. I chose 3. Third name is on the reverse. Why 3? Harold adjusted the pencil in his shirt pocket. Because the first two are human. He had canceled 2 cardiology appointments after Second Hearth closed. He did not dramatize the decision. He had simply refused to leave Patch without a plan he trusted. "I am not asking anybody to save me from getting old," Harold said. "I need to know Patch will not pay the bill on a day I cannot drive." Naomi confirmed Patch's medical records. Celia assigned the caregivers. Rebecca approved the key protocol. Harold signed the pilot agreement. By Friday evening, 6 households had completed the process. 6 animal files rested in separate color-coded folders. 6 owners had chosen backups. No single person held every key. Miriam gathered the small team in the fellowship hall before they left. She did not offer a sermon. She bowed her head and gave a short prayer. "Lord, keep us honest about what we can carry, grateful for those who carry beside us, and faithful in the small work placed before our hands. Amen." No one added anything. Outside, the evening sky was clear, but a winter storm watch had appeared on the county bulletin board. Evan looked at the 6 folders inside the locked cabinet. For the first time, his initials did not appear on every page. Second Hearth Relay was ready to begin its trial. Whether it could endure being needed was another question. The storm reached Silver Creek after midnight and erased the southern half of town by morning. Snow pressed sideways against St. Luke's stone walls. The windows rattled in their frames, and wind drove white sheets across the parking lot faster than the plow could clear them. At 7:12, the lights went out. The fellowship hall fell silent except for the fading hum of the refrigerator and the click of Celia Boone's battery-powered clock. Then the emergency fixtures came on. 2 dim bulbs glowed above the doors. The rest of the room remained gray. "Generator should have transferred in 10 seconds, Evans said. He was already moving toward the utility room. Celia opened the aluminum case containing the paper copies of the relay schedules. Miriam checked the church's landline. Naomi called her clinic before the cellular signal weakened further. Belle followed Evan until the first metal door slammed in the wind. She stopped in the hallway, ears back, then returned to the fellowship hall and settled beneath the end of Celia's table. The new program had been operating for 3 weeks. 6 households, 6 animal files, 12 primary and backup caregivers. Enough structure to look dependable on a quiet day. The storm had not come to inspect how it looked. Evan knelt beside the generator housing outside the rear wall. His right knee sank into packed snow before he remembered to attach the canvas guard he carried in his tool bag. The starter battery had power. The control panel showed a fuel delivery fault. He removed the side cover and found frost along the line running from the exterior tank. "Partially frozen," he told Celia through the handheld radio. "How long?" "If the heater wrap still works, 20 minutes. And if it does not, longer." Useful answer. Evan could hear pencils moving behind her voice. The landline rang inside the fellowship hall. Miriam answered. A neighbor on the south side of town had watched an ambulance leave Harold Wren's house 15 minutes earlier. Harold had become short of breath while shoveling a narrow path for Patch. The paramedics had transported him to the hospital in Leadville. Patch remained at home. The neighbor had used Harold's spare key and was sitting with the old terrier. But she needed to leave within half an hour to care for her husband, who used oxygen. The county road to Harold's property had not been fully cleared. Celia repeated the information over the radio. Evan looked toward the church parking lot. His truck stood beneath a growing ridge of snow. Chains were already mounted. The route to Harold's house was difficult, but not impossible. "I'll go," he said. "No," Celia replied. "I have the vehicle for it. You also have the generator open. I can close it and return. Who starts the generator?" "Wade can come." "Wade is repairing a failed service line near the fire station." Evan tightened his grip on the radio. Patch was an 11-year-old dog with daily medication and a heart condition of his own. The neighbor's 30 minutes were already passing. "I know the road," Evan said. "I can reach Harold's place before anyone else." From another radio near Margaret's apartment, a faint burst of static interrupted. Then Margaret's voice came through. "If you leave the generator, who keeps the coordination room working?" Evan turned away from the wind. "I'll be back quickly." That is what I used to say whenever I kept one more key. This is not about keys. No, it is about whether the plan survives the moment you become frightened for someone. The sentence landed harder because Margaret's voice carried no accusation, only recognition. Evan looked down at the exposed fuel line. His first instinct had always been clearest when something went wrong. Identify the danger, move toward it, remove it. That instinct had saved lives. It had also allowed him to avoid a harder question. Who continued the work after he left? Inside, Celia opened Harold's paper file. The online schedule could not be reached, but the folder contained everything Harold had prepared. His lockbox code, Patch's medication chart, Naomi's clinic number, the names of 2 approved caregivers, the address of the temporary intake room at the Hale house, a handwritten instruction in Harold's precise block letters. Patch will hide under the workbench if frightened. Do not pull. Place blue towel near carrier. Harold had done his part before the emergency arrived. Celia called the first caregiver on the landline. No answer. She called the second. A retired postal worker named Ruth answered from a house 3 blocks from St. Luke. Her 4-wheel drive vehicle could manage cleared streets, but not the unplowed county section. "We have a caregiver," Celia said over the radio. "We need a road." A diesel engine sounded beyond the church wall. Colin Hale entered through the side door, wearing his brown canvas jacket and carrying snow on both shoulders. His navy cap was pulled low over his forehead. "One truck is running," he said. "The other lost a hydraulic seal." Celia looked at him. "Can the running one clear Wren Road?" "If the drift at Miller's Bend has not hardened." "Can you clear it without leaving the marked route?" "Yes." Rebecca Sloan had arrived before the roads worsened and now stood beside the paper files with her ox blood case closed at her feet. She had no operational role in the relay, but she remained responsible for ensuring Colin followed the conditions of his supervised service. Colin did not ask to collect Patch himself. "I can open the road," he said. "Send someone behind me." Evan came back inside long enough to retrieve a heat gun and an extension lead from the battery station. He heard the proposal and shook his head. "No." Colin's face tightened, but he did not argue. Celia did. "Reason?" "The visibility is poor. He drives snow routes for a living. He abandoned Belle during a storm." "Yes," Celia said. "That is why he is not entering Harold's house or handling Patch." Rebecca faced Evan. "Responsibility is not blind trust. I know that. Then build the limits." The room waited. Evan looked at Colin. The man had lied, hidden money, and left a puppy beside a winter road. None of that had disappeared. But the road outside did not care whether Evan felt ready to trust him. It cared whether someone could open it safely. Evan took Celia's pencil and drew 3 checkpoints on the county map. Colin clears to Miller's Bend and reports. Ruth follows in her vehicle but stays 200 yards back. A second volunteer rides with her. No one proceeds if radio contact fails. Colin nodded. "At Harold's gate, you stop," Evan continued. "Ruth and the second caregiver enter together. You remain with the plow." "I understand." "Patch goes to Naomi's intake room. You do not transport him." "I understand." The words did not create forgiveness. They created a task with boundaries. Miriam walked to the bell rope near the rear of the sanctuary. The normal morning bell had already sounded before the power failed. 3 slow strikes outside the usual hour carried a different meaning under the relay's emergency plan. Registered volunteers within hearing distance were to open their radios or call the church landline. Miriam wrapped both hands around the rope. For one moment she bowed her head. "Let our promises be stronger than the weather," she whispered. Then she pulled. The first bell rolled across the snowbound town. Bell rose from beneath Celia's table. The second strike passed through the church floor. The third traveled outward into the white distance. Within minutes, 2 radios answered. One volunteer confirmed that the Ruiz household had heat and sufficient food. Another reported that Mrs. Dalton's cat had been moved to the backup caregiver before the storm. Celia marked both names on the paperboard. Colin waited beside the door for the route order. A metal panel outside tore loose from one corner and struck the wall with a sudden crash. Belle scrambled backward, claws sliding on the tile. Her body pressed against a filing cabinet, eyes wide. Colin was closest. He did not approach. He lowered himself several feet away and placed both hands flat on his knees. Then he tapped twice against the wooden leg of a chair. Belle's ears shifted. The familiar sound cut through the wind and metal noise. She stopped retreating. Colin did not call her name. Belle remained beside Evan when he entered from the hallway, but her breathing had slowed. For a few seconds, Evan saw the whole contradiction without trying to simplify it. Colin had once known how to calm her. He had also left her. The first truth did not excuse the second. The second did not erase every act of care that had come before it. What mattered now was which truth Colin chose to live by next. "Route is open to checkpoint 1, Celia said. Colin stood and left. Evan returned to the generator. The heating wrap had failed, so he warmed the line gradually with the heat gun, protecting the fitting from sudden temperature change. His knee throbbed against the frozen ground. Twice he heard radio calls from the fellowship hall and nearly stood to take over. He forced himself to remain where he was needed. At Miller's Bend, Colin reported a drift nearly 4 feet high. He cleared one narrow lane, backed to a safe turnout, and waited until Ruth's vehicle confirmed passage. At Harold's gate, he stopped as ordered. Ruth and the second caregiver used the lockbox code. Patch had hidden beneath the workbench, just as Harold's file predicted. They placed the small blue towel near the carrier. Patch crawled out on his own. His medication was checked against the chart, logged and packed. The 2 caregivers carried him together through the snow, while Colin kept the access road open. No improvisation. No single rescuer. Only people following work that Harold had prepared before he needed them. Evan reconnected the fuel line and reset the control panel. The generator turned once, stopped. He waited 5 seconds and tried again. The engine caught. A deep mechanical rhythm filled the utility room. Lights returned through St. Luke, one section at a time. The hallway, the fellowship hall, the radio table. When Evan walked inside, Celia was marking the final box. Patch had reached Naomi's intake room. All 6 relay households had been contacted or checked in person. Belle crossed the room and leaned against Evan's left leg. He rested one hand on her shoulder. No one he applauded. Celia simply handed him the checklist. "You may write your initials on the generator line." Evan looked at the other completed tasks. Different names filled every row. The next morning, the storm had weakened enough for Rebecca and an insurance representative to inspect the records at St. Luke. They found radio logs, paired assignments, medication confirmations, and written reports from each checkpoint. The relay had not functioned perfectly. One volunteer had missed the first call. A radio battery had failed. The temporary intake room needed a second space heater. But no one had worked alone, and no animal had been left to chance. Colin arrived with the final financial records in a sealed box. Under the terms negotiated with County Council, he signed a repayment schedule, accepted supervised community service, and surrendered any remaining financial authority connected to Margaret or Second Hearth. The legal review would continue. Consequences remained. So did the work. Before leaving, Colin stopped near Belle, but did not reach for her. Belle watched him from beside Evan. Colin touched 2 fingers to the wooden doorframe. 2 quiet taps. Belle's right ear tilted toward him. That was all. Outside, the road crews continued clearing snow beneath a pale blue sky. 3 bells had called people to their assigned places. For one night, Evan had stayed in his, and the work had continued without waiting for him to carry all of it. By late April, the snow around the old Hale house had retreated into narrow white ridges beneath the fence. The house itself looked almost unchanged from the road. The cedar siding remained weathered. The porch still leaned slightly toward the garden, and the apple trees stood bare against a clear Colorado sky. Inside, however, nothing depended on one person knowing where everything belonged. Supply shelves carried printed labels. Veterinary records were stored in a locked cabinet with 2 authorized key holders. A whiteboard listed the caregiver on duty, the backup caregiver, and the person responsible for confirming that both had answered. The former dining room had become a training space. The downstairs bedroom could hold 2 animals during short emergencies, 3 only with Naomi's written approval. Second Hearth Relay had not become a crowded shelter. Most animals stayed in verified homes. The Hale house served as a place for supplies, training, and brief handoffs when a hospital visit happened faster than a family could prepare. The limits were posted near the door. Naomi had insisted on that. Compassion expands to fill every available room, she had said. Insurance does not. On the morning before the official opening, Belle ran through the training room with one of Evan's work gloves in her mouth. She was nearly 6 months old now, long-legged and still growing into her paws. Her honey gold coat had deepened beneath the black saddle across her back. Both ears stood, though the right one tilted outward whenever she became tired or suspicious. Evan followed her around a folding table. "Belle!" She increased her speed. Celia Boone remained seated beside the scheduling board, watching the pursuit over the top of her clipboard. "Have you considered assigning the glove a backup handler?" Evan stopped. Belle stopped too, still holding the glove. "That is not helpful. It is extremely consistent with policy." Margaret laughed from the doorway. The sound came more easily now. Her speech had strengthened, though fatigue still slowed her near the end of a long day. She lived in a 1-story apartment 3 blocks from St. Luke, where she could walk to the courtyard in fair weather and reach her kitchen without navigating stairs. She still used the graphite cane outside. Inside the Hale house, she moved short distances by touching the backs of chairs placed deliberately along the wall. Moving away had not erased the importance of the house. It had allowed Margaret to decide what the house would become. Belle dropped the glove when Evan offered a small biscuit. Margaret shook her head. "You paid her. I negotiated. You surrendered. Those are sometimes the same thing." Belle carried the glove beneath Margaret's chair and lay across her shoes. 3 months earlier, Margaret had signed the ownership transfer at Naomi's clinic. Rebecca had met with her alone first, confirming that no one had pressured her and that she understood the permanent nature of the decision. Margaret had not surrendered Belle because she believed age had made her unworthy. She had chosen Evan because Belle needed long walks, daily training, and the steady physical balance required to manage a young German shepherd through the years ahead. The decision hurt. That did not make it wrong. Belle visited Margaret every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On some visits, they sat in the apartment courtyard. On others, Margaret practiced fastening Belle's harness while seated, keeping her recovering hand involved without pretending it could do what it could not yet do. Evan remained close, but he no longer hovered over every movement. That change had taken longer than the paperwork. Behind the Hale house, Colin repaired the final section of fence under the terms of his supervised service agreement. He had made 5 payments toward the money he owed. He no longer held financial authority for Margaret or Second Hearth. He did not carry a main key, approve expenses, or enter animal rooms without another authorized person present. Consequences had not vanished because he had cooperated. Neither had the possibility of change. Colin arrived on time, signed the work log, and completed whatever task Celia assigned. He had learned to stop explaining himself before anyone asked. Trust returned more slowly than fence boards. That afternoon, Evan went behind the generator shed to check a pressure reading. Margaret needed Belle moved from the training room to the enclosed yard before the next group arrived. Celia stood beside the door holding the leash. Colin had come inside to return a drill. Belle approached him, then paused. Colin did not reach for her. Celia looked from Belle to the harness. "You may fasten it," she told him. Colin's hand stopped near his side. "Are you sure?" "I'm supervising. That is what supervision is for." Evan had returned far enough to hear, but remained outside the doorway. Belle looked toward him. He made no signal. After several seconds, Belle stepped in front of Colin and turned her back. She glanced over her shoulder, waiting in the same posture she had used beside the winter road. Colin lowered himself slowly. His fingers closed around the blue-gray harness strap. The yellow repair stitching Margaret had once sewn remained visible near the buckle. He fastened it. Then he pulled the buckle twice. Click, click. Belle stood still. Colin immediately handed the leash to Celia. No one praised him. No one called the moment forgiveness. He had been given one bounded responsibility and completed it correctly. For now, that was enough. Evan watched Colin return to the fence. There had been a time when Evan believed mercy meant reducing consequences. Later, he had begun to understand it differently. Mercy could leave the weight in place while still allowing a person to carry it toward something better. Harold Wren returned home after 3 days in the hospital. Patch had stayed at Naomi's temporary intake room, sleeping beneath the blue towel named in Harold's emergency instructions. When Harold came to collect him, Patch walked past 2 volunteers, ignored Belle entirely, and sat on Harold's boot as if no absence needed explaining. Harold began speaking at relay training sessions for older veterans and their spouses. He brought the dented metal box containing Patch's records and placed it on the table. "Planning is not admitting defeat," he told them. "It is refusing to make your bad morning somebody else's disaster." Some people listened with folded arms. Others asked where they could obtain a lockbox or how to authorize temporary veterinary care. Harold answered what he knew. Naomi answered what he did not. No one was treated like a helpless person waiting to be saved. On the day Second Hearth Relay officially opened, the gathering remained small. There was no stage. A volunteer entered the wrong medication time on a sample form, and Naomi made the entire group correct it. Margaret had to sit down halfway through her training talk because her right leg grew tired. Colin worked outside the fenced animal area, replacing damaged gutter clips. Belle stole Evan's glove again. Patch slept through Miriam's welcome. At noon, the group walked from the Hale House to St. Luke for the beginning of the first official duty rotation. The church windows stood open to the mild air. Sunlight lay across the wooden pews, and the bell rope hung beside the rear wall where Miriam had pulled it during the storm. A new duty board rested near the fellowship hall entrance. Evan found his name on the first line. Beside it were the hours he had agreed to cover. Below his name were Celia, Naomi, Miriam, 2 foster families, and an emergency number answered by the county volunteer desk. No blank space waited for Evan to fill. Miriam stood near the bell rope in a navy jacket, her small silver cross resting against a cream blouse. "We need someone to begin the first rotation," she said. She looked at Evan. He shook his head. "Margaret founded the program." "Margaret is not on the first shift." "Then Celia should do it. She built the schedule." Celia checked her watch. "I am already doing my job." Evan looked toward Miriam. "I am not the owner of the house. I did not create the program. I am not the reason these people came." "No," Miriam said. "You are one of the reasons it continued. That doesn't make this mine." Margaret stepped beside him. She wore a dark green sweater with the silver branch pin fastened above her heart. Belle stood near her cane, watching the rope move slightly in the breeze. Evan lowered his voice. "I don't need to be honored." Margaret followed his gaze to the rope. "It is not a medal." He said nothing. "It does not say you carried more than anyone else," she continued. "It only says your part is beginning." Her hand tightened once around the cane. "And when your part is finished, the next person takes the rope." Evan looked at the duty board again. For years, the sight of another person's name beneath his own would have felt like evidence that he expected to fail. Now it looked like a promise made in both directions. Someone trusted him to come. He trusted someone else to come after. Evan reached for the rope. The fibers were rough against his palm. Miriam bowed her head but offered no long prayer. "May we be faithful to the work," she said, "and humble enough to share it." Evan pulled. The first bell crossed the valley. Belle raised her head. The second rolled across the roofs of Silver Creek and toward the roads where volunteers had once waited for one woman to call. The third faded into the bright spring air. No one applauded. Celia checked the time and announced that the first shift had begun. The room moved again. Folders opened. Keys were signed out. Naomi reviewed one final medication note. Margaret sat beside a new volunteer and demonstrated how to ask an older pet owner what help was wanted instead of announcing what help would be given. Evan released the rope. It swung once, then settled for the next pair of hands. Several mornings later, winter returned briefly to the mountains. A thin layer of new snow covered Evan's porch and brightened the timber house before sunrise. The distant bells of St. Luke carried across the valley. Belle lifted her head from the rug. She did not race to the door in panic. She found the blue-gray harness near the coat hook, took one strap gently between her teeth, and brought it to Evan. Then she turned her back and looked over her shoulder. There was no note tied to the harness, no plea asking a stranger to stop. Evan fastened the buckle and tested it twice. Click. Click. Belle waited while he checked the duty schedule onto the refrigerator. His name appeared beside the morning visit. Celia's name stood beneath it for noon. Evan called Margaret. "We are heading your way." "Bring my glove back," Margaret said. "That is my glove." Belle has taken a position on the matter. Evan looked down. The missing glove lay beside Belle's front paws. "I will negotiate." He ended the call, put on his coat and opened the door. Belle stepped onto the snowy porch, but did not pull him toward the road. She waited while Evan locked the house. For the first time in years, he was not leaving because he believed everything would fail if he arrived too late. He was leaving because someone expected him, and if there came a morning when he could not answer, other names were already written beneath his own. Belle's story reminds us that responsibility does not always mean carrying everything alone. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is prepare well, accept our limits, and trust good people to take the next shift. In everyday life, grace often looks ordinary. A name written beneath ours, a phone call answered, or a hand reaching for the same rope when our strength is gone. May God give us the courage to show up when it is our turn, and the humility to let others stand beside us. If this story spoke to you, please share your thoughts in the comments and tell us who has helped carry a burden with you. You are warmly invited to subscribe for more stories of loyalty, second chances, and quiet grace. May peace be with you and those you love.